Our next speaker is Sally Lehrman. Sally is a senior fellow at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. She's an award-winning reporter and writer for media outlets including Scientific American, Nature, Health, the New York Times, Salon, and National Public Radio. Thanks. Her honors include the 1995-96 John S. Knight Fellowship, a Peabody Award, the Peabody Robert Wood Johnson Award for Excellence in Health and Medical Programming, and the Columbia DuPont Silver Baton. She's the author of News in a New America, published by the Knight Foundation, and her talk is entitled Taking Up the Cry When Genetics, Race, and Newsprint Meet. Sally Lehrman.
Thank you, and thanks to the Newkirk Center and to my fellow panelists. I think this is such an exciting and interesting discussion to be part of. And that question, what continues to fuel race? That's one of the things that I'd like to focus on in my talk as we talk about why do journalists have such a hard time accurately covering race? Why do we see the kinds of things that Jay was talking about? Why, if you will, are we so gullible? Because I really am talking about myself as part of this problem in a way. So today I'd like to ask you to consider the ground into which this seed is planted. What U.S. society thinks about as common sense about race, and the institutional values and structures in journalism that support these ideas within race that we keep reiterating. So I would like to start with a personal story about an ancestor. About a century ago, people used to say that Jews were naturally more susceptible to tuberculosis. African Americans too. Physicians said they both had small chests and weak lungs. An alternate explanation was popular too: poor housekeeping, bad habits like spitting in the street. That was about the time my great-grandfather, pictured here, got tuberculosis. He was Jewish, and ended up in a sanatorium in Denver, Colorado. And there they thought that clean air and lots of sunshine, the theory went, would cure you. And so they would put these beds out on porches, and as one TB doctor told me later, well, this method will either cure you or it will kill you. So learning about that, I got interested in claims about race and the interlocking of race with TB. And as I was reporting an article for Scientific American last year on TB, scientists told me, well, yes, TB does seem to favor certain groups. African Americans, Asian immigrants, people from India, Mexico. But they said it's not because of some sort of biological distinction, it's because of the social circumstances that these groups find themselves in. It's the crowded housing, the miserable workplaces that we often find TB really loves. And yet, I heard molecular biologists speculating that maybe there was something in African American people's cells, they didn't know quite what, that might make them respond differently to the organism. So they had begun a study to find out. A 2010 paper in Human Genetics described genetic markers for susceptibility to TB. And in those papers, or in this paper, it said that they had found a genetic marker that was held in common between whites in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Argentina, as well as Africans in a particular part of Africa, even though we're from a variety of ethnicities. And this marker was different from the one that they had found in African Americans, also from North Carolina and South Carolina. Now, I didn't mention either of those in my story for Scientific American. Why? Well, African American cells, what was that? And the human genetics article, while that was very interesting, I was really having a hard time with the division of populations. So North Carolina, South Carolina, Argentina, Caucasians, North Carolina, South Carolina, African Americans. It was starting to get very fuzzy and kind of vague. So I concluded, and I think as you can see, that science is still quite interested in finding race in tuberculosis biology, other types of biology as well, but maybe a little uncertain, I would suggest, about what race really is. So why, though, does this still have such traction in the news media? Why are the news media so attracted to these sorts of biological explanations for race and for health inequities? Well, in my talk today, I'd like to draw from the work that I do in inclusion and diversity in the news media and also improving science journalism. And I'll start with the traditions and ethics within journalism itself, and then connect that for you with some of the historical problems we've had covering race, especially race, and then the intersection of race and science, and particularly in health. And then I'll share 3 projects in which I'm trying to work with other people to reshape coverage. So let me start with the ethics part. Journalists actually have some very highfalutin principles, and we take the responsibilities conferred by the First Amendment very seriously. As this is taken from the Code of the Society of Professional Journalists, it's the preamble telling journalists what we're here for. Well, public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. And that is meant to inspire us to do this, to adhere to these ethical practices, which are seek truth and report it, act independently, minimize harm, be accountable, and be transparent. So as you can see, to journalists, information equals empowerment equals democracy. And yet, so that sounds really great, right? And yet we see blunders like these. So take a look at this headline about Jeremy Lin ran on ESPN. This went up in the middle of the night. An editor was, finishing his shift and put that up there, and half hour later when it was discovered, it was taken down. I'll show you an egregious infographic about an airline crash in San Francisco that killed 2 Chinese girls, schoolgirls, next. And I'll let you read it for yourself. This ran on KTVU, Oakland. And yes, it ran on the screen, and an anchor read these names aloud. My point is, though, this is not the work of a deliberate racist or, in these cases, an especially clueless or sloppy person. That would be an easy explanation, and it would be easy to solve. The resignations and firings that followed in both cases would have put an end to it. It's more complicated. Consider in the Oceana crash, a producer raised a question about those names, and a managing editor, herself of Asian descent, signed off on the screen. So my point here is racial thinking in science news coverage is embedded in an already troubled system, a system regarding race and racial categories. And it's not just in the newsroom, but in the newsroom, we're in a system under pressure. You know all about that pressure. Declining advertising in spite of steady audience demand, erosion of resources, layoffs, a 24/7 news cycle that requires constant filling. We have to feed the machine, as we put it. We have an environment pressed for time, space, and your attention. This is an environment primed for reactive thinking. So while Jonathan raises some great points about the implicit association test and the problems and way it has been applied, I think implicit association theory is a really helpful way to think about how this stuff happens. The news environment is an environment primed for reactive thinking, for reflexive attitudes. It's prone to those automatic mental reactions to social groups, to those mind bugs that we've learned through our social environment. And what are the mind bugs that are at play and that keep emerging? Well, in society, race, gender, and so we see these sorts of errors in these high-pressure environment. The fears and favoritism, the stereotypes that we carry under the surface that we may consciously disagree with emerge. And so we see it in these occasional blunders, but we also see it systematically working throughout journalism as a whole. Some examples of this are the sources we consult. Well, we consult the people we're comfortable with, those we feel familiar with. Who's considered an expert? people who already have socially high status. Who is representative? Well, who pops into your mind when you think of a poor person? And who pops into your mind when you think of an executive? Oops, my slide is missing. Well, I had a good picture of magazine covers with executives who are all white. So mind bugs, here we go, I got behind. There it is, who we consider executives. So mind bugs creep into this important story, such as this one. This was a really well-reported story attempting to look at disparities emerging from the ways the states were responding to Affordable Care Act, and the states that had decided that they would not participate in federal matching funds. But look at the way this is characterized. The author says, these new policies will leave out 2/3 of the poor blacks and single mothers and more than half of the low-wage workers. How are those groups paired or separated, if you will, grammatically? Here we have poor blacks and single mothers in one group and the low-wage workers in another. So that's fairly subtle, but this is the type of thing that emerges on a regular basis. And I could say, well, the report, it probably came out of the data, but the reporter didn't think about the implications. What about this one? Later on in the piece, which was called Millions of Poor Left Uncovered by Health Law, we find out minorities will eventually become a majority, a pattern that has produced a profound cultural unease. For who? So journalists often believe themselves fact gatherers, immune from social pressures, independent observers, beholden to no one and nobody. When I talk to journalists, they say, I write what I see. Well, the question is, what are you able to see? How many legs does this elephant have? And this came up earlier. Walter Lippmann observed this in 1921. He was a journalist, a writer, a reporter, a political commentator. He is the person that came up with the term stereotype as we think of it today. And he said, the facts we see depend on where we are placed in the habits of our eyes. So this is something we have to keep thinking about in journalism. Now, to be fair, in journalism, we know we have a race problem. We've had a race problem for a long time, but we've been especially aware of it for about 30 years, I'll say. And let me give you a little bit of history on that. In the late 60s, President Lyndon Johnson appointed the Commission on Civil Disorders to investigate the roots of civil disorder that was happening throughout major cities throughout the United States. And what it came to be called the Kerner Report, named after the person who chaired that committee, they decried America's separate and unequal society. And they said, there are deepening racial divisions and discrimination and segregation. One of the reasons, they said, they pointed squarely to the media. They said, news coverage is causing special harm. The overarching criticism, they said, was media report and write from the standpoint of a white man's world. The media ignored the inequality in these cities. The media left non-whites, the minorities without a voice, and the whites who were reading the news media, were reading the papers, had no idea what was going on in these other parts of the city. So the editors stepped back and said, okay, we know we need to do something. And since then, work has concentrated on these two areas, on staffing and content, and on intercultural awareness. So the idea with staffing was, well, if you get enough diverse staffing, and then sourcing accuracy and fairness will follow. Seemed like a good idea, but we've been really having a hard time even getting the diverse staffing. We're still at about 86% white newsrooms across the country. Sourcing is about 60% white. Intercultural awareness, the view that white journalists especially can correct their habits by spending time in other communities. Good enough. But these strategies have a drawback. Just like cultural competency efforts in medicine, they can essentialize and stereotype, the idea that one can stand in for all, almost a sort of paint-by-number approach. And to give you an example, an intern working in a popular public radio talk show came to me and said, you know, we had such a problem desperately searching for diversity on our show, and we needed a Latino voice. But the problem was it had to be a voice, it had to be someone who had a Spanish-sounding name and somebody who had at least some accent. In addition, we see newsrooms' efforts to think differently bumping up against U.S. institutional systems. So, for example, there's a big debate still about whether racial identifiers should be used in crime stories, and particularly regarding allegations and when someone is being searched for. So what would you do if this campus safety alert, this is a real one, went out on your campus? Suspects are described as Hispanic males, no further description. Who would you look for? So on the one hand, we have newsrooms debating, well, should we say Hispanic male? And then on the other hand, you have newsrooms and editors trying to get more clicks by publishing things like this. And what is the message? So we have, these are mug shots. It's just a stream of mug shots that the Arkansas Democrat Gazette posts along the same page as government employee and public university salaries. And the idea is this is the public has the right to know. And I just ask you, what is the message here? When it's a continuing stream, we know about the inequities in arrest. So let's look at that in the context of science and medical coverage. Remember, seek truth and report it? Well, truth is messy. But science offers a shortcut. Journalists hold the perception, held by many biologists themselves, that science operates outside of society and represents that truth we seek. Scientists deal with facts. They provide analysis. Journalists feel we understand the process and trust the results. So, as Quentin Cooper from BBC Radio 4's put it, scientists values detail, precision, the impersonal, the technical, the lasting, facts, numbers, and being right. Doesn't that sound like an ideal science journalist? So we buy into this view that science transcends all our social messiness. The dangers in science reporting, according to this view, come down to not quite getting it right, not quite translating properly, as opposed to all the other elements we normally bring to journalism, which is questioning, checking the facts, checking the interpretations we're offered. So only now we're starting to get journalists who really think about, okay, what are the business interests driving the science? Who's funding it? How is science a social institution? When are you getting or when are you really asking better questions about the institutional pressures on science, the personal loyalties, and the disputes? Recognizing the role the scientist is playing. When are you getting the scientist, promoter, entrepreneur, fundraiser, or when are you getting the one that's talking to his or her colleagues and trying to refine the science? When are you getting the dumbed-down narrative version that's dressed up, oversimplified for public consumption and probably wrong, or easily made wrong? So the thing that journalists, and I think the public also needs to understand, is that scientists are equally pressed to make science interesting. They too are competing with celebrity cleavage and cats to make science interesting. So now we'll place science coverage into this uncertain context of race in America. Remember the debates about the appropriate category label to give George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case. So, and this kind of illustrates it. So was Zimmerman Latino? Was he Hispanic? Was he white Hispanic? Was he white? Journalists, you can see, may be very relieved by the kind of precision that science seems to offer up in this messy world. It's easy to see by the kind of those diagrams that Dwayna was showing make it all seem so clear. And note the precision offered here. This is the American Museum of Natural History's webpage about an exhibit they were having. And you can see Asian, African, and European seem to all have very clear and distinct DNA. And the other thing The other thing that it says is race and health, moving beyond race. So genetics can help us move beyond these messy categories. Don't forget, too, there are scientists who state quite strongly that race is real in a biological sense. And some will say, well, we're really talking about geographical ancestry, but then they go right into racial terminology. Every week, a new study comes out that seems to somehow explain a health disparity using genetics. There's a gene that makes it so. So we end up with this problem of fuzzy definitions and often of a false sort of balance that we saw in the early days of climate change coverage. And I just have this slide to show that balance in the early days of climate coverage was all about, well, is it human generated or doesn't it exist at all? And even though there were very few people who said it didn't exist, journalists felt that because they had to balance, they had to put them both in there. Now we see balance moving to be in the area of, well, what really is the debate about human-generated climate change right now? And in a way, that's where we need to get to go with race and genetics. What is the debate about? How do we discuss it in a way that doesn't reflect just back into our old ways of thinking? Another institutional structure that I wanted to tell you about, having to do with the way we think about race in journalism, comes down to framing. So a frame is a term used in journalism to describe how a journalist thinks about the story after the reporting is done, and then how do I shape it to help my audiences understand what is important, why does it matter, who is responsible, and then what's next. So how can I shape it so my audience knows what to do with this information, how to move forward. When we're talking about race, stories often are framed around empowerment. They're framed around social struggle, they're framed around justice. We talk a lot about in our field about giving voice to the voiceless, about shining light on injustice. And so we're eager to offer information that seems to explain social inequity. The idea that we can correct injustice through genetics is clearly very alluring. So information itself is power, as I showed you earlier in our thinking. So the story of genes and racial disparities then fits very nicely into that frame. Here's an example. So here's a piece that is a story about an attempt to recruit Latinas for a genetic study. The emphasis is on empowerment. Hispanic women need to get involved in research, it says. But who is this population, we have to ask? Hispanics are a highly diverse group. The story explains quite simply that they are not white. And the disparity is explained as a genetic problem. The reason, well, of course, because the genetics at the center of the story are doing genetic research. But is it responsible for the journalist to solely focus on that way of thinking about this health disparity? They do mention one other cause briefly, and it's obesity. So is that even helpful? And then let me show you another example. This stunning story. Let's see, do I have it? Yeah, okay. This stunning story goes right to genetics as an explanation for gang membership. It comes from a news outlet for an African-American audience, News One. You would think that members of the black community could put forward a lot of other explanations, but remember of the allure of science as clear-headed truth. And I'm calling it confirmation bias because it confirms underlying assumption about the bad seed in African-American youth more generally. What's wrong with the way the science is presented here? Well, if we look closely, we see that the researchers, one, they generalized to all young men, yet the published research, the journal article, pointed out that the DNA sample they used was not representative of all young men in America. If we look at the numbers, the study looks pretty good at first. It was over 1,000 participants, but only 53 were actually gang members in the study. So that's what they're basing this on. And we don't know their race. The study itself was 67% white, 17% black, 15% other. But you see how neatly it falls right into this frame. And the third element was Both gang membership and weapon use, which the whole result hangs upon, were based on self-report. So the boys' own descriptions. And the reference to violence is based on just one question about weapon use. To put it strongly, it's not very strong. But before we blame it on the reporter, let's look at the press release. FSU study links warrior gene to gang membership weapon use. Boys who carry a particular variation of the gene, MAOA, sometimes called the warrior gene, are more likely not only to join gangs, but also to be among the most violent members and to use weapons, according to this new study. So who here is responsible? And look what happens when the same gene variation is studied in young white men in college. In this case, Caltech and nearby community college students. They found that these carriers were better at taking potentially lucrative financial risks. So it's a gene that makes you good at taking risky decisions. Same gene, same variation. So when we cover, in journalism, when we cover science and race, we drop our trademark skepticism. We assume precision. We fail to, as my mother told me when a friend would say something nasty to me, consider the source. And we fail to question our own assumptions, and those of science itself, and so does the audience. And this is just a picture of Ian Wilmot with Dolly saying, we simply do not have the knowledge or tools to be very accurate or precise. And this is something that not only journalists need to learn, but so do our audiences. So there are three areas in which I'm working in order to try to change this and develop our ideas a little bit further in the field. One is the Science Literacy Project. And this is a project that's been going on for about 10 years, and we're trying to get a little bit more funding to keep it going. The point here is just check the data, check the conclusions, read the journal article. We ask journalists to think about conflict of interest, think about categorical thinking that's built into the science itself. Ask questions about what is that alternate explanation. Break out of the limits of the beat system and learn to link business and science and culture. Second one is tracking opportunity. You could think of this as kind of a race literacy project. Here we help journalists see that race is a social system and no enterprise is immune, including our own. Yes, race reporting has improved. We do cover health disparities, we cover other sorts of inequities, but we need to go beyond that. So now we're hoping to teach journalists to report on the structures of race that are built into society, the interlocking systems that hold race in place. So we use, for instance, this Robert Wood Johnson illustration to show that we're reporting on the outcomes, but we really need to look externally to these structures that shape it, and we're looking at that in criminal justice, education, other fields too. And then getting to that reactive thinking, recognize that our own habits and perceptions about race enter into reporting and interpretation. Overall, we're trying to disrupt this race determinism and reductionism built into reporting. Thirdly is an ethics project, really, but I think it ties in nicely. It's called the Trust Project. And this is about digital journalism ethics and engaging with ethics in new ways. These parameters are 5 ways that the Hutchins Commission in 1948 said a responsible press needs to adhere to if it's going to remain free. And so we want to remind ourselves, okay, we need to be truthful, comprehensive, and in context, provide a forum for exchange of views and values, represent all constituent groups in society, help society clarify its goals and values, and of course provide access to information. So this is news at its best, and we're convening executives throughout the news business to come together and think about, well, what does this mean today in the digital world now? And how can we promote what we think is already trustworthy news, but how can we strengthen it and also signal it to our audiences? And so I want to tell you about this project we're doing right now. It's a Twitter haiku contest, and since you're all intellectuals, I want you to join in. You have till midnight. to write a haiku that tells why you think, what are the signals you use to know when news is trustworthy or not. We've been hearing a lot about not trustworthy news. And these are some of the haikus that have come in. Poorly worded dreck from invisible sources breeds skepticism. A little bit more positive one, a moving river, new clear words are flowing by. To drink, know the source. So, in essence, we're trying to move journalism along, but we need the public's help and we need scientists' help. So, wherever you're coming from to this subject matter, whether you're a researcher, a journalist, or a member of the public following the news, question the questions, question the interpretations. I was surprised that the scientists I spoke with about TB had no idea about those ideas about race that had been held a century ago connected with tuberculosis. So we all need to be alert to these deeply rooted ideas that shape our thinking, that shape our research, and that shape our reporting and interpretation. So thank you very much.